Welcome to the first episode of Season 2 of the Josie to Lagos podcast. Today, we are talking about the future. First question, where will China be in 2025? We can determine that answer by looking at their Made in China 2025 strategic document. So what we know is that China will continue to be the dominant force in low-wage manufacturing. They will continue to be the factory of the world. But on top of that, by 2025, they will add to that high-wage manufacturing. What is that? That is aerospace engineering, electric cars, advanced robotics, artificial intelligence, 5G infrastructure. They are already rolling these objectives out, and their agenda is to achieve them by 2025. According to their strategic document, they will achieve this by doing four things. Number one, setting explicit targets. Number two, providing direct subsidies. Number three, foreign investment and acquisitions. They want to invest in foreign firms and to buy foreign firms, bring in the technology and expertise in order to be able to be dominant in those high income sectors. Number four, they want to mobilize state-backed companies and empower those companies to become dominant players in all of the spaces. And the result of all of this is that they will be able to increase their per capita income from where it currently sits at $8,100 per year to over $15,000. America is sitting on about $56,000 per capita income on average annually. China is chasing that target, and by 2025, they will have expanded their per capita income to almost double. And the implications of that is that China is going to be well on track to overtaking the United States of America on all of the economic metrics. By some metrics, they've already overtaken America, but by 2025, they will have overtaken America. We know, and this is the important thing to note about China, is they are committed to their strategic documents. They are highly disciplined, and whatever they write down, they are serious about implementing. We saw it with the Belt and Road Initiative. We've seen it with their manufacturing growth in the last 40 years. And therefore, when you look at their strategic documents, you have a clear indication of where they're going to be in 2025. But what about Africa? Where will Africa be in 2025? Number one, we're going to be more indebted to China. China is giving debt trap diplomacy loans to Africa. They're giving African leaders loans so that those African leaders can show infrastructure projects, which are mostly white elephants in that they cannot be used by the people. But the result of those loans is that you owe Chinese banks, you owe the Chinese government, and they don't give free loans. They want something in return. It's resources, it's control of strategic ports. And as we are seeing, Africa is on a trend of borrowing more and more from China. And it's in China's interest to keep borrowing Africa that money because they can cash in on that check down the road. Number two, we are going to continue to see more old leaders milking the populations of Africa for the benefit of their families and their elite networks. This has been going on. It will continue to go on. We will see, number three, more old revolutionary parties staying in power due to, number one, exploitation of their liberation credentials. You know, this whole "we freed you" energy that you get from African dominant political parties. And number two, they will continue the exploitation of rural communities to stay in power. And they exploit rural communities through food parcels and farming implements. What else will continue to be true in Africa? Number four, we will continue to see high levels of population growth. And in fact, the population projection for 2025 is that Africa will have 1.5 billion people living on the continent, most of them under the age of 25. Number 5, the annual income per capita in sub-Saharan Africa, which currently sits on $1,600 per year, or if you want $134 per month, which if you're listening in Southern Africa converts to 2,000 rands per month. That per capita income is actually not set to increase. It's set to stay the same or even go lower. The result of this is COVID, but also the increasing digitalization of manufacturing around the world, the increasing, use of technology to reduce the labor costs and thus sell things more expensively to Africa. And if you consider also the leadership of Africa, you can see that our poverty levels, our income per capita is not necessarily going to head the right direction. Number 6, the poverty levels in Africa. Let me give you an indication of where they were sitting and then where they're going to be in the next 2, 3, 4 years. According to the World Bank, in Africa, sub-Saharan Africa more specifically, there were 278 million people living in poverty in 1990. That's on less than $2 a day, less than 30 rands a day, right? There were 278 million people living in poverty in 1990. By 2015, that number had jumped to 413 million people who were living in poverty. It increased in sub-Saharan Africa between 1990 and 2015. There was an increase in those 25 years. And what we are seeing from last year's reporting is that poverty actually increased during the COVID period. 100 more million people are projected to have been added to the number of people who are living in poverty in Africa on less than $2. So that brings those numbers to over 500 million people living in poverty on the continent, a continent of 1.3 billion people, and over 40% of the continent is living in poverty. That's going to continue into 2025. There is nothing that has happened on the continent right now that indicates a change in any of those metrics. There's nothing in the leadership that indicates a change in any of those metrics. There's been the rollout of the African continental trade area, but the implementation of the idea is moving at such a slow pace that no one is projecting to see any results from that rollout before 2025. I mean, I could go on, but the picture is clear. Regions like Europe, places like America and China will continue marching into the future of technology and prosperity, while Africa continues to be a source of mineral and human resources. Don't forget, it's not just the minerals of Africa that serve the world economies. It's also the human capital, the brain drain, the doctors, the engineers, all of the people who come out of the townships, struggle to be brilliant in spite of the conditions of their environment and end up, with distinctions, with A grades. They wind up in American and European universities and now even Chinese universities. And they don't come back to Africa. They don't come back to serve Africa. So Africa provides its most talented, its most brilliant to the economies of the world, while providing all of its mineral resources for a discount price with little or no benefit to its economies. The global powers continue to fund and to normalize human rights abuses by several regimes. The Chinese do not even care about human rights regimes in Africa. And as a result of this, the projections for Africa are not positive. The projections of Africa, if you only look at the old people who are currently the custodians of power, are not positive. The reality is that the old men at the helm of Africa have failed. The institutions that they have created have failed. And as a result, nobody should be looking to those institutions and those men to solve the problems that Africa is facing. The old men who lead Africa are surrounded by hero worshippers who continuously remind them about how great they are because they liberated Africa from colonialism. They are surrounded by people who do not challenge them on the realities that young people in Africa are living through right now. These old leaders have taken care of their families. They've sent their children to study at Oxford and Harvard and Cambridge and wherever else around the world. They've accumulated farms and palaces and mansions, not only in Africa, but in other parts of the world. They have externalized the funds that they control into offshore bank accounts, many of which are beyond scrutiny. So they don't care because they are financially sorted and their families have this thing we all aspire to, generational wealth. And they are also not going to change things or step aside because they are scared to leave their seats of power because many of them have got bloody hands and they have been stealing for a generation. So they will stay in power till they die because the incentives are such that that's what they have to do. This is why you see people who are like Paul Biya continuing to stay in power in Cameroon. People like Yoweri Museveni of Uganda continuing to stay in power. I mean, Paul Biya has been in power now for 39 years. Museveni is going now for 35 plus years of being in power. So if you think that Africa will change by 2025, that's not going to happen as these old leaders remain at the helm. The reality is we need new leadership and we need young leadership. But youth by itself is not enough. Youthful energy by itself is not enough. And protest is not enough. What we've seen with End SARS, with Fees Must Fall, with other movements all across Africa is that the youth have energy, the youth have passion. But energy and passion are not going to reshape the continent. They are going to lead to conversational moments that captivate the global audience, but they're not going to change Africa. And the youth of Africa need to be cognizant of that. More is required. More organization is required. The youth of Africa need to start thinking in terms of coordination, in terms of synchronized communication. There has to be a linking of creative strategic thinkers in Nigeria to creative and strategic thinkers in Namibia to creative and strategic thinkers in Zimbabwe. Because what we've seen is that Buhari is still president of Nigeria. The police are still, irreverent towards constitutionality, towards human rights in Nigeria. Right now in 2021, even after End SARS was a successful hashtag, we know that Bobi Wine is under house arrest in Uganda, even though his campaign captivated not only Uganda, not only Africa, but the world. There's a podcast of Bobi Wine with Bass, this guy who raps with J. Cole, and it's on Spotify and it's been listened to hundreds of thousands of times. There are so many articles covering him, discussing his energy and passion and the conditions of the youth in Uganda. But Yoweri Museveni still created an electoral environment that only favored him. Yoweri Museveni still arrested all of the prominent leaders of Bobi Wine's People Power movement. That's the reality. So youth by itself is not enough. Passion by itself is not enough. Articulating your voice on all of the global platforms by itself is not enough. The reality is we need practices, we need disciplines, and we need ethical values. We also need conviction that we can turn this massive disaster that is occurring on the continent around, the disaster of poverty, the disaster of lack of delivery, the disaster of inequality, the disaster of being technologically behind the rest of the world. We need to change that, but we also need to be cognizant that young people can be corrupt too. So just focusing on youth is not enough. We need to focus on the values. We have seen corrupt student leaders. We have seen young scammers. We have seen young criminals. So if we, the youth, are going to step up to the mantle to redirect Africa, to create different outcomes for Africa, that has to be done on a standard which is ethically robust. We must not allow for ethical grayness. We must not allow for this attitude which is creeping in, where some young people in political and civic spaces are now co-opted by the regimes in power. And we sanitize that because they are deemed to be succeeding, because they have a car and a house and nice devices, and they can pay for, the social activities of the group. And as a result of that, some of them are now getting by. We are accepting young Mugabes. We are accepting young Musevenis, young criminals, young political thugs. And if they continue on those trajectories, the outcome will be an amplification and multiplication of what they already are. And that's why we cannot accept that. That's why we cannot accept those norms which don't come with ethical standards attached to them. We've seen the risk of having zero ethics or being relaxed about ethics in Africa. But beyond making sure that young leaders pursue standards of ethics, several skills are needed across the board. We can no longer rely on talk. We need every young African to be learning and perfecting people management. I'm going to mention 6 things. Number 1, people management. Number 2, project management. Number 3, management finance. Number 4, operations management. Number 5, technical expertise. Number 6, quality control and quality assurance. What we have seen across the continent is leaders who take shortcuts, leaders who cannot deliver on any piece of paper. If African leaders say they are going to deliver 10 bottles of water in a speech, expect one and expect a glorification of why that one was actually delivered at all. They will cut a ribbon for the one bottle while 10,000 people go hungry, while 10,000 people go thirsty. It's not acceptable. It's not acceptable. So we have to reflect on our educational gaps as we've been growing up in townships and rural areas, in all of these places of squalor. And the reality is we've not really been taught, and thus we must teach ourselves, effective people management, effective project management. High school students are not managing projects in township schools because the township schools don't have resources to inculcate some of those things. And as a result, we go through life without understanding some of the nuances of these management principles. And this is shown at our leadership level. And if we want to change it, we have to manage that. I mean, I've been to so many weddings, funerals, birthdays where you can see that there was no understanding of project management and the people who did it, where everything was done last minute with corner cutting, with no scope, with no project plan, with no quality control, quality assurance, nothing. Now, these things are not traditionally learned in a schooling environment. They're oftentimes learnt in affluent homes, and they are learnt in business schools and management schools where a lot of Africans cannot afford to learn. But we must now take and use the internet as a tool to equip us with this expertise. We also need to go beyond just political expertise. We need technical expertise, because the reality is that there's a massive skills shortage on the continent. We need lawyers to have expertise in their field, teachers to have expertise and master their field. Engineers must master their field. We can no longer just let people into the room because we share the same complexion when they cannot deliver. We need that solidarity in terms of agenda, but we also need the proficiency and excellence in terms of execution. And we can no longer have this attitude where ANC guys will just find someone who fought the struggle with them and put him in place, and ZANU-PF guys will find someone who they were in the jungle with and put him in a critical place. We need skills to compete with the rest of the world. Singapore became the country that it did because it specialized in making sure that the people who were in the civil service were excellent and that there was no room for corruption in that civil service. If we want to replicate the outcomes that other nations have achieved, continentally, we have to start setting these standards for ourselves. And we need to remove corner cutting from our business practices and from our civic practices. We need to move beyond talk and we need to move beyond excuses. Our older generation of leaders have no shortage of grand speeches. They can talk all day and all night. They can regale you with all kinds of stories about how they freed Africa. They can regale you with all kinds of visionary documents that are somewhere for the country, for the continent. Africa does not need more excuses. Africa does not need more storytellers. What Africa needs is people who are committed to progressing the continent and taking the continent forward. But more than that, we need a performance mindset. Where Africa is right now, for me, reminds me of two generations that are in the early biblical stories. And you don't have to believe in the Bible to take this. Generation 1 was the Moses generation. Moses goes to Pharaoh and says, "Set my people free." There are struggles, there are miracles, the people are eventually free to be in the desert. A hostile environment, an environment of poverty, squalor, punishment, pain. That's where they are. But that generation does not see the promised land. The generation that sees the promised land is the Joshua generation, because they have the faith, the vision, and the skills to go into that era, into that period. And I think where Africa is now is we have the Moses generation, which has reached their best before date. Now the question is, are we willing to be the David generation? The Joshua generation. The David story is another one that makes me think about where Africa is right now. Because if you think about it, Saul had an army which was being taunted by Goliath all the time. They were being taunted. You had Saul and his generation. David's brothers were part of that army. But it took a young David to come and hear the taunts of the army and actually defeat the giant. The problems that Africa is facing right now are giants. And Africans must face them. Young Africans. This continent is hella young. But we have to step up. Now, if there are Africans who are interested in moving the continent forward, and I think you're one of them, the work won't begin when you're a leader. The work must begin now, in our homes, in our small businesses, in our families. Leadership is not just about national and regional and places of glory and recognition. Leadership is about our operations in all of the spaces we occupy. In fact, the reality is we cannot grow our accomplishments as a continent until the culture of excellence is instilled at every level. David, who I used as an example earlier, did not become a leader in the limelight. He became a leader when no one was watching, when there were no crowds and there were no rewards, when it was only about good stewardship, when it was only about protecting his sheep from the attack of all kinds of violent animals. Now, the question I want to ask you today as you're listening to this podcast is, what are you doing to prepare to be a continental leader? Are you waiting for a big position? Are you waiting for something major to happen? Or are you going to try to perfect and master the skills that are required, the mindset that is required for you to become actually impactful on the continent? You may not be the continental leader, but your son could be, your daughter could be, right? And that's really where I want to start the tone in this year, in the first episode of this second season, is we can't continue like this. We can't. We have to do something else. So if you've listened this far, there's a competition and there's a prize, a small prize. It's a book on Thomas Sankara. Now, in order to be eligible to win this book prize, you have to live in South Africa for the time being, because of COVID, cannot really make deliveries outside of South Africa. So you have to live in South Africa, and then you have to answer this question. On what day did Patrice Lumumba get assassinated? On what day did Patrice Lumumba get assassinated? So you have to answer the question, and then you have to retweet the episode advert when it's posted on the Josie to Lagos Twitter handle and my personal handle. You can choose whichever one you want to retweet, but you have to retweet with the answer to the question. So quote the tweet specifically. So that's the competition. It's going to run up until Friday, and then the winner will be announced over the weekend, and delivery will be arranged. So what you can look forward to in the rest of the year, we're going to first start trying Monday and Friday episode uploads, moving from being a weekly to twice a week. And then we're going to try to do short sections as well as longer sections, so deep dives and commentary. And then we're also going to start doing some case studies, biographical case studies, revisiting the great lives of great Africans, some more. We did 1 or 2 last year. We're going to continue doing that and doing more of those. We really want Josie to Lagos to be the continental think tank for neo-Pan-Africans. Pan-Africans who want to chart a new path, who want to explore new applications of different ideas that have been contested on the continent for the progress of the continent. This podcast seeks to explore what's wrong with Africa, but also how can we fix Africa. That's really the agenda of all of these conversations, moving from today to the foreseeable future. That's been the agenda from day one. So thank you so much for tuning in for the first episode of 2021. Looking forward to more and more episodes. Let's grow the community. Let's grow the quality of the podcast. If you have any feedback, I'm more than happy to hear what your feedback is. This has been Mighty Jamie on Josie to Lagos.